The Dallas Morning News reports the story of a young girl named Rebecca Charleston, who grew up just outside Fort Worth, Texas, in a middle-class family with 6 siblings. When Rebecca was only 5 years old, her older brother committed suicide by drug overdose. Her family was left in shambles and unable to cope. During this time, Rebecca moved in with one of her friends, who, by the time she was just 16, had already introduced her to drugs. By the time Rebecca was 17, she had already been raped multiple times, but remained silent for fear of being blamed. Her parents had kept in some contact with her and became increasingly worried about her growing drug use, and decided it was best to enroll Rebecca in an institution for troubled girls in East Texas. On a home visit just 6 months later, Rebecca escaped and never looked back. She found herself on the streets alone, with no food, no family, and no shelter. Just the next day, Rebecca met a group of people who offered to take her in and provide for her needs. Tragically, Rebecca found this would come at a cost, as she was forced to begin stripping in order to earn her keep. "I hated what I was doing," Rebecca said. "I remember just feeling gross, sitting on 56-year-old men's laps, drinking shots of Hennessy just to make it through one night." One night, Rebecca met a man who she believed could change her life forever. He was the first person in a long time who seemed to actually care about Rebecca and to share her interests and her dreams. A few days later, she found herself trapped in the backseat of this man's car, being told exactly what to say to men who would want to have sex with her and how to perform. In the discussion of prostitution, there are a few terms that are important to define. Based on a collection of research, prostitution will be used to describe a triangular relationship between a buyer and a seller and a victim, for the sake of monetary profit or social and political gain, for the return of sex, making this a practice of serial rape. Oftentimes, society views this as entirely distinct from sex trafficking, which is legally defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to victimize a person for the sake of a commercial sex act. However, the only difference lies in the practicality of the matter, and that trafficking necessitates a trafficker. The important similarity to note is that both sexually exploit human beings. In America alone, there are 1 million women and girls enslaved by prostitution, which represents only a portion of the 27 million victims worldwide. Of these girls, over 91% were sexually abused as children, and often victims of incest as well. Of youth who are runaways, 90% flee sexual abuse in their own home, as over 11% of parents are responsible for exploiting their own children. In addition, within only 48 hours, 33% of all runaways will end up in the sex industry. A life overcome by this kind of sexual abuse leads to severe trauma and fear in a person's life, resulting in 44% of sexual abuse victims attempting suicide in their lifetime. There are also a series of push and pull factors which drive exploitation. Push factors are those which push a victim away from their current situation, whether that be abuse, neglect, poverty, or even addiction. Pull factors are those which prey on the vulnerability of these women and manipulate them based on their desire for familial belonging, romance, or even simply physical provision. The first point that is critical to understand is that prostitution is inherently exploitative and includes a 3-step process. The first of these steps is the act, which is the recruitment of these women and girls and the enslavement of human beings, often known as a receipt of persons. The means by which this is done is through force, fraud, coercion, or even forced dependence. And together, these support the purpose, which is ultimately exploitation, sex, and forced labor. It is critical to understand the demand-heavy nature within prostitution. As long as people continue to demand sex, pimps will continue to supply these women, regardless of any value for human life. In fact, the global sex trade is the fastest growing form of commerce in the world, worth over $32 billion annually. Part of the reason that drives this demand-heavy nature is pornography in today's culture. Pornography itself is sex trafficking, as the women are those being trafficked, the pornographers are the traffickers, and the viewers are the customers. Pornography is bought sex online, which then increases demand for it in the flesh. Tragically, it is often used by pimps to train young girls in how they ought to perform in prostitution. Pornographic sites themselves receive more activity than Netflix, Twitter, and Amazon combined in 1 month, resulting in a total of 4,599,000,000 hours consumed in 1 year alone. It is also important to understand the chain of power within prostitution, which broken down is domination, degradation, and subservience to the pimp. In addition, prostitution is a human rights violation. This human rights violation begins when a child is sexually abused, as they are stripped of their rights at an early age, and the idea that they are simply another person's property begins to be instilled in their mind. These women in prostitution live in a country founded on the basic principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, prostitution strips them of all of these. These women fear for their lives on a daily basis, as they endure extreme physical violence. In fact, the mortality rates for women in prostitution are 40 times higher than that of the average woman. Next, they are kept in extreme captivity, with little to almost no normal human interaction at all. And lastly, they are kept from pursuing any sort of value or happiness in their day-to-day lives. Prostitution as an institution silences these women. On top of the pimp silencing them through physical violence, the current legal system does as well. The way the current legal system is set up, women caught in prostitution will be charged with the same severity as the very person responsible for exploiting her, thus making any incentive to turn to law officers for help or refuge very little, if at all. And lastly, prostitution is a resort of those with the fewest choices. Rarely do you find the upper class elite enslaved in prostitution. Rather, it is those barely hanging on in poverty. A woman does not fight against all odds to become a prostitute, nor does any young girl dream of becoming one when she grows up. Rather, she is prostituted when the odds beat her. The second point that is critical to understand is that the psychological trauma resulting from childhood sexual abuse significantly increases the vulnerability of these women and therefore the likelihood to be exploited. All children are born with a brain stem, which is the survival part of their brain responsible for automatic systems such as heart rate, breathing, and the stress system. All children are also born with a prefrontal cortex, which is the executive part of their brain responsible for decision making. However, when a child is first born, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed and only becomes so through the environment that the child is raised in, as well as parental influence. Therefore, if sexual abuse is present in this person's childhood, their prefrontal cortex will never fully develop, as they are forced to remain using their brain stem and the survival part of their brain. This cycle only continues in women in prostitution, as they are constantly sensing danger and therefore never using the prefrontal cortex. Their ability to resist is completely incapacitated by the trauma that they have faced. A life of sexual abuse can lead to a series of disorders as well, the first of these being the attachment disorder. All humans are born with the need for connection. This connection is usually first established between a mother and her child when they make skin-to-skin contact for the first time. This child will learn to rely on its parent to meet its every physical and financial need, as well as emotional. However, if a child is sexually abused, this attachment will become entirely warped and disfigured, leaving this person highly vulnerable to manipulation. The second disorder often faced is that of the repetition compulsion. This is the theory that traumatized people commonly re-traumatize themselves without knowing it, in an attempt to establish an active role in something they were previously forced to take a passive role in. This is explicitly seen in sexual abuse victims, as they were forced to have sex at so young of an age and are desperate to override this memory. Third, this can often lead to psychological paralysis. Oftentimes, sexual abuse happens at so young of an age that the child does not even realize what is happening, and their body will respond in self-protection by mentally and physically numbing itself. This helps explain why trauma victims often experience a lapse of memory about the trauma itself, while they still may experience certain physiological reactions to smells, places, or people. Lastly, anyone who has experienced trauma in some way usually experiences symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Although PTSD is usually associated with war veterans, women in prostitution experience the same levels as these veterans. Within PTSD, there are three categories, including hypervigilance, which always expects danger, intrusion, which shows the imprints of trauma, and constriction, which is a numbing response of surrender. The third and final point that is critical to understand is that past and present sexual abuse enables continued exploitation, resulting in a debilitating effect, which profoundly inhibits these women from extricating themselves. Pimps are trained manipulators who have practiced a series of enslavement tactics over centuries. The first tactic often used is that of force. Pimps commonly resort to extreme physical violence to keep these women from attempting to resist or flee at any given moment. Next, they may resort to fraud, and with that comes the false promises of a hopeful and luxurious future. Pimps always paint a glamorous picture of what these women's lives will look like, whether that be a way to provide their children with food or even to give them an education. However, these false promises are only to be met by neglect and abuse. Pimps know that these women have most likely been sexually abused at some point in their life and recognize the vulnerabilities that they may face. These women are constantly seeking affirmation of their value that they never received as a child, and therefore pimps will consistently lure them through promises of a relationship and love. Imagine never feeling loved and finally finding it. You would never want to admit that it was all just fake. A third tactic commonly used is that of coercion, and with that may even mean the threatening of loved ones' lives. The ultimate effect of these techniques is to convince the victim that the perpetrator is ultimately omnipotent, that resistance is futile, and that ultimately their survival is dependent upon complete compliance to their pimp's every wish and desire. In fact, the biological mechanisms which detect danger shut down in instances of severe trauma, leaving the person highly dysregulated and dysfunctional, and therefore vulnerable to manipulation. The fourth and final tactic often used is that of forced dependence. By this, I mean that pimps will do everything in their power to ensure that these women depend on them to meet all of their needs, whether that be physical, financial, or emotional. One way of doing this is by forcing drugs upon these women. First, it ensures that these women will come back once they are addicted. And second, it runs the risk of them being arrested. This only further adds to the bondage that these women face, as their pimp will now be responsible for paying their bail, and can then hold this financial debt over these women as a constant reminder of power and authority. These women now not only are in extreme financial debt, but hold a criminal record, making their ability to seek jobs elsewhere next to none. Many modern Christians today view prostitution as simply a sin and therefore something that ought to be condemned. They say that these women are actively choosing to live in sin and therefore ought to live with the consequences. However, dating back to biblical times, Jesus encounters several prostitutes in his life, and not once does he treat them any differently from any other sinner. He never looks upon them with a strictly condemning eye, but rather with one of love and with grace. As Christians, there is a moral imperative to see the kind of exploitation inherent in prostitution as a complete juxtaposition to the love and grace of God. Christians ought to see these women as precious children of the King, with inherent value rather than with some insignificant value given to them by society. To contrast, modern feminists will argue that prostitution is not only acceptable, but even empowering for these women to use their body how they want. This stems from moral relativism in today's culture, stating that it is not only acceptable, but empowering for a person's body and mind to be completely destroyed, as long as it is their choice. This position also assumes that women chose to be here in the first place, which has already been shown to be false through the numerous physical and psychological chains placed on them due to past sexual abuse. If the average age of entry into prostitution is only 12 to 14 years old, these girls would legally be declared minors, and thus it would be labeled sex trafficking. Turning 18 or becoming a legal adult does not all of a sudden change this situation to make it this person's choice, and thus as society would call it prostitution. Rather, it would seem that being abused of upwards of 6 years would only further enslave a person, rather than give them the clarity of mind to extricate themselves. In conclusion, there are many lies believed by society today about prostitution, leading many people to believe that it is simply some women's promiscuous choice of employment. However, this is a result of a misinformed society, who are quick to make hasty judgments about people before knowing them or their stories. Based on the research presented, and the women I have personally known to be victims, not one has chosen this life of prostitution, or even wants to be there. However, they've been enslaved by the invisible chains resulting from past sexual abuse. Childhood sexual abuse has served as a stepping stone for these women into prostitution, stripping them of their rights at an early age and leaving them highly vulnerable. Let us no longer be a misinformed society. Rather, as Christians, let us rejoice, knowing that no chains are too great for God to break. As Psalm 107 says, "And they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and burst their bonds apart. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. For he shatters the doors of bronze and cuts in two the bars of iron." Thank you.